Israel in the North American universities. Amir Opek is the director of the Civil Society Affairs Department at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. I'm honored to invite Professor Elxanan Yekira, my childhood friend, to deliver the opening remarks. Elxanan is the author of the book Post-Zionism, Post-Holocaust, and several other books of philosophy. His most recent book, Spinoza and the Case for Philosophy, was published a few weeks ago. Welcome.
Good evening, everybody. I'm very glad. Welcome too. I'm very glad I have the chance to give you some opening remarks. I shall not be very long. The first thing that I want to say is that I think we should appreciate the kind of work Kari and Gavriel have been doing, especially in editing this book, an important book, and in general in getting out of the closet and conducting a real fight in defense of Israel, Zionism, also Jewishness in the United States. They'll talk about it. But I think they deserve a real big thank you on our part. The first thing that I want to say is actually something completely different. Last night, yesterday evening, I attended a very interesting discussion on Mount Scopus, on the occasion of the publication of a book by an Israeli historian, Shlomo Aronson, on Israel and the problem of nuclear power. And as one of the participants said, someone who is not accustomed to walk in the corridors of Mount Scopus, he was doubtful whether Israel does have the bomb, he said, but if it does, he thinks he knows now where it has to be, it can be put away. Nobody is going to find it if it's put in some of the rooms in Mount Scopus. And, but most of the people thought that actually, according to foreign publications, Israel may be having some kind of nuclear option. And the discussion actually now, on the more serious way, the discussion was very interesting. It addressed all kind of strategic questions concerning how to deal with the existent or non-existent Israeli nuclear option, etc., etc. Why I'm telling this? Yeah, most of the things are more or less known by now to most of us. The questions and the possible solutions. Why I'm saying it? Why am I telling it? Because this is, I think, one way that the question we are going to address today has to be put in perspective. The question is important, and many people like myself who have been involved with this in the last 10 years or so become very often obsessed with it. When you read the literature, when you read the things that are said and written and done by the BDS people, the lies told about Zionism, about Israel, you can get really very obsessed with this, and many of us become very concerned and deal a lot of time with this. However, as I said, this has to be put in perspective. And Israel is, according to foreign press, of course, a nuclear power, and the BDS is limited. After all, phenomenon. Yeah, it is an important thing. And I think that about a few questions should be addressed here. And I'm going to suggest to the panel to address more or less the following questions. I would say there are three types of questions that have to be addressed. The first question is the what question. What is going on? And this is a very important question to be discussed here in Israel, because people in the United States and in Europe, where it happens, know more or less what happens. I think we in Israel do not really know what's happening, what's going on. Those of us who visit on campuses in the United States and read the press have a better idea. But it's still a limited picture, I think, even of those of us who visit the United States, for instance, quite often. So this is, I think, one thing that I would, a question I would put to Gabe and Kerry to describe the situation. What's going on? The second question, I would say, or group of questions, I would call it the diagnostic question. For instance, how harmful it is. And when I ask how harmful it is, it has to be divided into four different sub-questions. Geographically, first of all, how important it is, how harmful it is in the United States. Because the way it worked in the United States, the effect it has on American Jews in the United States is quite different from the effect it has or doesn't have on us here in Israel. So first of all, how harmful it is, the geographic, or let's say, question put in space, here and there. And the second question is a temporal question. How harmful it is, but what is the potential damage it can do in the longer run. And here it becomes much more complicated, and also I think much more dangerous, and I'm sure we are going to hear about it. The third kind of question is the prognostic question. This is how I would put it. And basically it's the question that all of us ask, I guess, what, if at all, is done and can be done. And again, the question is divided into two. What can be done? Is anything done in the United States? By whom? Can anything more be done about it? And the second question, which I address mainly to the representative of the government, of the foreign ministry who is here, what is it? Is anything done really by the government, by the foreign ministry, for instance? Is there any thought about it? Is there any strategic appreciation, evaluation of the situation? Are there any means deployed in fighting or not fighting? Maybe not, maybe yes. Can we do anything about it? What can we do if we can? And how to deal with it if there isn't much to do against it, which is, some people think, is the situation. So these are the questions that I hope, I suggest, will be addressed by the panel, and I shall let them, the people who know the thing firsthand, now to talk. Thank you.
One pleasure of being in Israel for the last month for me has been to have a few interesting... One pleasure for me being in Israel for the last month or so has been getting to know Elhanan and to debate him a bit from time to time. And we've had the unusual and interesting experience of carrying on some arguments for an hour or so, by the end of which we realize we agree, which is, I think, a very standard Israeli thing to do, and something we're learning a lot about. Thank you all for coming out tonight, and for Memory for hosting this event. The questions that Elhanan raised, we didn't get any advance notice of, but of course we're quite capable of answering all of them nonetheless, since we live with this problem on a daily basis. What's happening? Let me just give you a couple of anecdotes or pieces of information. I teach at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. It's the flagship campus of the public university system in Illinois, in the middle of the state, in a dreadful sea of soybean fields. And every March for some years, the campus celebrates Israeli Apartheid Week and erects about a 50-foot long wall across the central part of the campus. And it's pasted with slogans, and there are talks and events around it. This September, the Jewish Studies program at the University of Illinois, which is funded largely by contributions, announced that since Israel had become such an unpleasant topic and such a criminal state, that the Jewish Studies program at Illinois is going to eliminate Israel studies from its curriculum. Apparently they're unaware, I'm an affiliated member of the program, but I have nothing to say about it. Apparently they're unaware that half the Jews in the world happen to live here, and that if you do Jewish studies, only about 50% of the Jews in the world, you might be missing something. But that's one simple indication of what impact BDS is having on some American campuses. And that's a startling, and I think, is there a feedback somehow?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Let's try it again. Better? Okay. That's one kind of startling example of the kind of transformation that's happening on many American campuses, most notably some of our best campuses. There are 3,500 colleges and universities in the United States. At many of them, students work 40 hours a week, barely scrape together enough time to attend classes, and they have no time for politics. But at more elite campuses, where students are residential, they have time to think and argue and write, there is time for politics. So the places where BDS is strongest include on the East Coast, at New York University. That's not a complete improvement.
This is part of the BDS.
Yeah, well, they're everywhere. Columbia University, the entire University of California system on the West Coast, at the major Big Ten institutions, Illinois, Minnesota, and so forth. BDS is very strong, and those are the campuses that are graduating future politicians, businessmen, professionals of all sorts. And as some students and faculty turn antagonistic toward Israel, it has the potential to do damage even to the state of Israel, not in the short term, but certainly in the long term. And December 3rd, I'm an English professor, but I went to the annual meeting of the American Anthropological Association because they were considering BDS proposals, and I'm part of the traveling anti-BDS road show. And I listened to parts of 4 panels that were conducted as rallies. It was an academic meeting, but people gave short anti-Israel speeches, met with applause and stamping and cheering. And I think among my favorite moments was a woman who got up, a faculty member, who actually teaches in Israel, got up to give a talk, and she said, "Let me just give you one example of what it's like in Israel. You arrive at Ben Gurion Airport, and there's a sign for Jews and a sign for non-Jews. 2 lines, one for Jews, one for non-Jews. Of course, this happens not to be true. Like every other international airport, There's a line for people with passports from the country and a line for people without passports from the country. But she got cheers and applause at this important fact that the audience was glad to learn. So BDS has reached the point in professional associations and campuses where it's perfectly fine for people to lie. They make up stories, audiences love it, and it proceeds in that fashion, rather unpleasantly. Why does it work? Why is this succeeding in the United States in this way? Because I think the movement really is growing, and I think it does present a long-term threat to Israel, not immediate, but long-term, as people influence American policy decisions who are increasingly opposed to the Jewish state. Well, first of all, the American left, of which I have counted myself a member for some decades, often operates out of a search for idealized victims. I was a student in the 60s during the Vietnam War, went to a lot of Vietnam protests, and often imagined that the North Vietnamese were a people of astonishing innocence, angels who dropped to the earth, no inherent thoughts of violence in them, an absolute commitment to democracy, innocence being abused. Obviously, there were some American prisoners of war who didn't feel quite that way about the North Vietnamese, but it was something that I believed for a period of time as a young student. I remain opposed to the war, criminal war, but I don't idealize the North Vietnamese as something different from all other human beings. That position on the American left, that idealized victim status, is now assigned to Palestinians. They now occupy this strange position of innocents who are absolute and unqualified victims. And the left often seeks that status for some people on earth so that it can imagine itself investing in pure justice, pure equality, and so forth when it champions them. I don't see that fantasy about Palestinians disappearing anytime soon, because the left mostly doesn't want to listen to facts. It wants to hold on to that illusion, and in the process, of course, imagining that those who hold on to the illusion are themselves ennobled by it. You get the sense that you are devoted to a selfless cause, and you get a sense of self-enhancement as a result. So there's a psychological dynamic to the criminalizing of Israel on the American left that isn't going to disappear anytime soon. At the very least, we know that it's going to get worse before it gets better. And how it would get better, I cannot say. I mean, one dramatic change, of course, can come as a result of Israeli policy. It's about the Mideast, after all, and events in the Mideast can change opinions throughout Europe and the United States. A change in settlement policy, a curtailment of settlement expansion east of the fence, the barrier, the wall, whatever it is in different places, that would have an effect, as would some plausible negotiations being resumed. So events here can affect the status of this movement, both in Europe and the United States. That said, I don't really know of any place less predictable on earth than the Middle East. Some people claim they knew exactly what would happen to the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. I kind of had my doubts. Anyone who predicted the rise of ISIS 2 years ago, I know is lying. There's a lot that happens here that you simply cannot anticipate. So events that we cannot really gauge may have an impact on the reception of the movement in the United States. Part of this process of idealization includes an idealization of the BDS movement itself. Every resolution supportive of boycotts in the United States begins by saying, especially if they're focused on boycotting universities, we don't boycott individuals, we only boycott institutions. They then often proceed to detail the ways that they're going to boycott individuals, or blacklist individuals, or do damage to them. But it's possible, in this remarkable way, to say both things. To say we only attack institutions, and then proceed to go on and to attack individuals. And that's become intensified in the last few months because the POCB guidelines issued on the West Bank for academic boycotts were revised at the end of July, and they're much more intensively focused on damaging people than they were before. They raise the possibility of blacklisting people who violate the guidelines. They recommend that study abroad programs in Israel be eliminated. They recommend that joint degree programs, a number of American campuses have joint degree programs with Israeli universities. They recommend that they be eliminated. And my simple contention is that if there's a joint degree program and you eliminate it, that actually affects the people who study in those programs. But there persists a kind of image of the Israeli university as an abstract entity, not something where people actually live and work productively together. So one of the ways we try to counter that is to present an image of the Israeli university in significant ways, many institutions, as places where Jews and Arabs study together and talk with one another and work together, as places where research collaborations go on between Jews, Arabs, Americans, Palestinians, and that all are potentially damaged by the boycott movement. So that fantasy that it's possible to boycott institutions without harming individuals is one of the most important counter-arguments that everyone needs to make against BDS, because they persist in it. In fact, BDS endorsed the POCB July guidelines, and in the same breath said, they're going to honor academic freedom and not harm individuals. So that lie persists, and it's a place where you can make a real difference. Where you can't make a difference in fighting BDS, and I think this is very painful, very frustrating, and very annoying, no one other than fans of Israel will listen to comparative arguments. So you can't say, have a look at Syria and Iraq. Israel isn't beheading people. Israel isn't enslaving women, ... No one's really interested in that unless they are already on your side. For the most part, BDS simply treats Israel as an exceptional case, isolated from the rest of the world, and deserving a concentrated attack and criticism, and they won't show any interest in comparative arguments. That's very painful because I think in many areas comparative arguments are the only things we really have. If you want to talk about proportionality in military action, you can't think about proportionality except by comparison. How have other wars been fought? What kind of collateral damage has been faced in other urban areas, ... Without comparisons, you lose a lot of the potential to make rational arguments. Nonetheless, there's no evidence that you gain much by comparative arguments in the battle against BDS, and there's a great deal of evidence, unfortunately, that you gain nothing by comparative arguments. So that is painful. But facts can help. So, in response to the lady... Oh, okay. We'll risk the feedback again. In response to the lady who talks about the two lines at the airport for Jews and non-Jews, you could sort of put up a photograph of Ben Gurion and show that's simply not true. Facts really do help, and that's, I think, the strongest thing that we've got in our favor. Now, what can be done? Well, from Israel, relatively little can be done. I mean, it's really, you'll suffer some of the consequences, but it is, after all, an American and a European problem. There's not a lot of impact that you can have. There are certain things that would help. If you run into some wealthy Jews who are traveling over here from the United States, you might tell them they could invest more in higher education than they presently do. That is, most of the major Israeli advocacy organizations in the United States don't prioritize higher education, higher education is the future of American leadership, and more effort needs to be made to fight BDS and to educate people about the state of Israel in the United States. So encourage some American friends to spend more money on higher education projects. That's one thing that would help. We also sometimes face an information deficit. So yesterday evening I opened up my email and got a copy of a several-page document attacking Tel Aviv University, quite detailed, and saying this is an example of a university that needs to be boycotted and why. Well, that document, I got it, yesterday. It will be distributed at a convention on Saturday. So that when that kind of thing happens, we need to be able to get information rapidly from Israel. We need people who know Tel Aviv University well to be able to rebut that. It's about a 5-page document. We need rebuttals of it, and we need it rather quickly because it's going to be distributed, in less than 72 hours. So we need a better mechanism for feedback from Israel when facts are available, when information is available. We need ways of getting it. Sometimes it doesn't exist. I mean, Israel isn't perfect with all forms of record keeping. Sometimes you need facts that just aren't available. But in this case, I think we ought to be able to get counter arguments about Tel Aviv University and be able to distribute them at the convention very fast, 72 hours. We need to get information. We need to type it up. We need to photocopy it. We need hundreds of copies to distribute it at the American Historical Association. We get that kind of time pressure, and I think we could get more help in doing that. This fall, I think in part because of events in Gaza, the level of aggression at professional associations, that is, disciplinary associations, especially in the humanities, English, history, anthropology, some social sciences, has ramped up considerably, and I don't see it abating very soon. The good news is that it's a disciplinary division. There's a lot of antagonism toward Israel amongst humanities disciplines, some social sciences. The sciences basically don't give a damn. If they've got a useful research project they can do with Tel Aviv, they'll do the research project. They're interested in advancing knowledge. They're not very much interested in politics. So this movement is confined largely to humanities disciplines with some social science disciplines. The book that we edited includes a statistical study of what faculty members have signed public petitions supporting BDS. And although I knew my own dear field of English was, highly visible in that, I didn't know till I read that statistical essay that 21% of the faculty members who've signed petitions in favor of BDS are English professors. So that was a number that was, my pride, soared at that point. I didn't know that it was that bad. So it is a phenomenon that's largely located in a coterie of disciplines, and in that sense hasn't spread through higher education as a whole. The future. I don't think it can be predicted, except to say that BDS is going to grow stronger and that we aren't marshaling enough efforts to defeat it. We need to do more. We need more education. We need more faculty members involved, traveling around the country, talking about Israel. On my own campus in the last year, actually, 3 assistant professors have come and talked to me and said they're very pro-Israel and they're afraid to speak out. They're afraid that it will cost them when they come up for tenure, that if they admit that they support Israel, they could pay a price, and frankly, I think they could. I advise them, well, stay quiet for now, but please stand up once you do have job security. So that pattern is going to continue. It's going to get worse, but at least we know that this is a battle very much worth fighting. Thanks. Slip by before you attempt it.
Okay.
Thank you. Professor Barahem.
Hi, Shalom, Erev Tov. It's nice to see you. Thanks for being here. You've heard a very fine, practical talk about the realities of BDS and some of the tactics that might or might not be practical. The focus of my talk is theoretical, conceptual, philosophical. I'm interested in the ways that BDS imagines itself and imagines Israel. I want to warn you, I'm going to read my talk, but the good news is that it shouldn't take more than about 15 minutes. I'm trying to be as precise as I can about this. I want to thank the organizers of tonight's event, and especially my good friend Elkhana Yekira, whose book Post-Zionism, Post-Holocaust inspired me so much when I read it, and I refer to it all the time. It's the best thing, I think, written on the topic of delegitimization, and I think I'm not alone in that judgment. My talk tonight, I should say it's an honor and a pleasure to be here in memory. My talk tonight has three main points and a number of slides that I hope will make it exciting for you. I want to make 3 points about the thought of anti-Israel academic boycotts, or BDS, in theory, in view of the stated positions of its own intellectuals. I focus first on what I call the philosophy of diasporism, in contrast to Zionism. Second, the rhetoric of intellectual terrorism, as opposed to the free exchange of ideas. And third, the logic of fetishism, or the psychological basis in fantasy of the ubiquitous, overzealous singling out of Israel for excessive criticism and unwarranted opprobrium by the forces of the academic left in Europe and the United States in particular. With regards to my third point about anti-Zionist desires, fantasies, drives, the Slovenian cultural critic Slavoj Žižek defines the ground of fetishism's lurid, irrational obsession according to the simple formula, I know very well, but nevertheless. This means that there is something I must know isn't the case, or can't possibly be true in fact, yet somehow, being human, I manage to seem to forget, repress, or set aside what I know, so as to persist in service to my passion. Anyway, in spite of what reason and evidence say, because I enjoy the fantasy too much to let it go. Don't kid yourself. BDS gets off on demonizing Israel. As I will show in the last part of my talk, please stay tuned, the precise specification of the boycott movement's Israel fetish goes something like this. In the rational part of one's brain, one surely knows that Israel can't actually be central to everything that's wrong with the world. But one likes feeling that it is, and will therefore act, speak, and write as if Israel is magic. And I have some examples to show you of this way of thinking. The movement to boycott Israeli academics is not an entirely reasonable affair, in other words, but something half-mad, sick, and twisted. Let's face it, BDS is anti-Semitic to the core. Insofar as adherents at some level drink the Kool-Aid of what looks a lot like the classic conspiracy theory according to which Jews control the fate of the world, even if one knows better. So, point 1, diasporism, or the ends of BDS. The idea of diasporism, as I call it, is that Zionism is the problem and not the solution. And it might have made sense to debate about diaspora and Zionism and Jewish nationalism and different conceptions of how Jews should try to survive and flourish in the late 19th and early 20th century. People like Dubnov and Ha'am and others had good reason to debate how should we go forward. But after 1948, to revive diasporism, I think, and the claim that somehow Jews are better off without a state, which is what I'll show you that BDS is doing, it's really kind of weird. The idea of diasporism, as I call it today, is that Zionism is the problem and not the solution, no longer the answer to the old Jewish question as once posed in Europe, but the form which the new Jewish question in the Middle East now takes. By mimesis and inversion, the solution to today's Jewish problem is thus half-mockingly presented in the irritating notion of some sort of ostensible right of return to diaspora for Israeli Jews, especially those of European background. For example, Judith Butler, a leading BDS thinker, in her 2012 book of anti-Zionist wit and wisdom, Parting Ways, Jewishness and the Critique of Zionism, reminds her readers that, ta-da, listen to this. Dispersion, or tzutzot, do you say, בעברית? Okay. אני תלמיד באולפן. Dispersion is the mode in which Jews have in fact survived. It's an astonishing claim, don't you think, given that she left out the word barely, or perhaps better, miraculously, in view of the 20th century's history. Nor does she credit the Zionist entity with having contributed, in fact, anything to Jewish flourishing. Instead, by contrast with the delights of statelessness, she notes that nothing risks courting aggression more than Israel's, in her words, colonial subjugation of the Palestinians, which can only be ended once and for all, as she argues at length in her book, by terminating Israel's very existence as a Jewish state. For Judith Butler, in short, the biggest threat to the well-being of the Jews is self-determination as a people in a state capable of defending itself. Nothing risks courting aggression more. Instead, Jewish sovereignty should be dispersed or done away with. What can one say to this? Where to begin? Fortunately, the great Philip Roth, are there any Philip Roth fans in the audience? Okay, thank you very much. Fortunately, Philip Roth already answered that question for us 20 years ago. What to make of this kind of thought, let's call it. We should start by laughing. The celebrated Jewish American writer anticipated by more than a decade Butler's surrealist turn in political philosophy with his 1993 novel, Operation Shylock, and he made fun of it. He made fun of this kind of thought. Composed in the wake of the First Intifada, Roth's fiction presents its reader with the uncanny figure of a doppelganger impersonating the author himself, traveling around Israel announcing public lectures under the catchy title, Diasporism, the only solution to the Jewish problem. Roth's fictional double earnestly but dementedly pontificates in a prescient parody of everything wrong with the thought of today's BDS movement, avant la lettre, as follows. And listen to this and see if you don't hear echoes of what's actually being written and disseminated and talked about today. Here you go. Diasporism seeks to promote the dispersion of the Jews in the West. It seeks to avert the catastrophe of a second Holocaust brought about by the exhaustion of Zionism as a political and ideological force. Zionism has become counterproductive and itself the foremost Jewish problem. Once the European Jews have been resettled and the population of Israel has been halved, those Jews who have lived in an Islamic cultural matrix for centuries can continue to do so in peace and harmony with their Arab neighbors. You know what will happen in Warsaw at the railway station when the first trainload of Jews returns? There will be crowds to welcome them. People will be jubilant. People will be in tears. They will be shouting, "Our Jews are back! Our Jews are back!" Whatever hatred for Jews may be present in Europe, there are ranged against this residual anti-Semitism powerful currents of enlightenment and morality, sustained by the memory of the Holocaust. No such bulwark against anti-Semitism exists in Islam. Exterminating a Jewish nation would cause Islam to lose not a single night's sleep, except for the great night of celebration. Israel is no longer in the Jewish interest. If Roth's satire sounds too far-fetched to be credited, even after my quote from Butler, as anything more than sheer farce, however, then please listen to Professor Mark Ellis, a contributor to the pro-BDS anti-Zionist anthology, Deconstructing Zionism, a critique of political metaphysics. Writes Ellis, the process of ending a Jewish state of Israel would probably precipitate a mass exodus of Jewish Israelis to Europe and the United States if, that is, the borders of the various states would accept millions of Jewish Israelis. See what happens. An interesting experiment. Albeit, Ellis is, as you may know, slightly less optimistic and more indifferent to the fate of the Jews than Roth's more solicitous fictional apparition. Nevertheless, the absurd premise of de-Judaizing the Jewish state for the good of all concerned is the same lunatic idea that Roth's narrative travesties. And all the other salient features of the passage I just read are manifestly present in much of the thought of BDS too, believe it or not. Thus, Michael Martyr and Gianni Vattimo, a couple of noted philosophers, Vattimo in particular is a highly respected philosopher, they confidently assert as follows: the biggest threat to the well-being and security of Israeli Jews, and often by implication of Jews who live elsewhere in the world and are assumed to be the supporters of Israeli policies, is neither Iran nor Syria. It is the state of Israel itself. By contrast, diaspora seductively beckons all those imbued with an appropriately postmodern sensibility since, quote, even when not openly anti-Zionist, the postmodern philosophy of deconstruction is the possibility of justice. And so it is the necessity of diaspora. It is imperative to deconstruct Zionism, not out of hatred, but out of intense concern for the Jewish Israelis, who are set on a path of self-destruction. Touching sentiments, to be sure, yet in a radio interview last summer, before you get too warmed up by these touching sentiments, recall in a radio interview last summer, one of Italy's best-known living philosophers, the deconstructionist thinker, who I just quoted, the very same Professor Vattimo, expressed his intense concern as follows: I'd like to shoot those Zionist bastards. He went on to recommend that Hamas should be supplied with better rockets, surely once again out of compassion for the Jewish Israelis' weird self-destructiveness. Moreover, in his chapter titled How to Become an Anti-Zionist, Vattimo urges that Ahmadinejad of Iran was right all along to demand the end of the state of Israel. Can you feel the love, the intense concern? And this is stuff published on an academic press, by the way, a respected academic press. And part of the point of my talk is that I'm citing respected academics. In short, ending Israel is a moral imperative from the diasporist point of view that rejects or deconstructs, or with Philip Roth, parodies Zionism for the benefit of both Arab and Jew alike. Even though, interestingly, it is the Jews alone who are to be treated once more to the improving effects of diaspora, while ironically, the Palestinians are condemned to suffer a fall into what the BDS philosophers themselves must recognize better than anyone as the metaphysically dubious fictitiousness of all origins. Which brings me to my last two quick points about intellectual terrorism and the Israel fetish. The French philosopher, sociologist, and literary theorist Jean-François Lyotard defines the essence of terror in an information age as the threat of exclusion from conversation, dialogue, exchange of symbols. By terror, Lyotard writes in a classic text, I mean the efficiency gained by eliminating or threatening to eliminate a player from the language game one shares with him. BDS fits this model of argumentation by intimidation perfectly. As the leading BDS scholar activist, Stephen Salaita declares openly in his book of 2011, Israel's Dead Soul, multiculturalism is a place from which Zionists deserve expulsion. It isn't clear what place there is that Zionists don't deserve expulsion from, by the way, according to Professor Salaita, but multiculturalism is a place from which Zionists deserve expulsion, he says in a kind of terroristic language, I would call it. A kind of intellectual terrorism is at work here. In the same chapter, he repeats for emphasis, we need to kick Israel out of multiculturalism, insisting on his dream of what I call ethnic studies cleansing. Moreover, BDS pursues its threats of exclusion, expulsion, and elimination by resort to intellectual terrorism as defined by the cultural critic Ibn Warraq. Terrorism, in an academic context, Warraq observes, means seeking to convince not by arguments or historical analysis, but by spraying charges of racism, imperialism, and Eurocentrism from a moral high ground. Anyone who disagrees with the practitioners of politically correct terrorism in theory has insult heaped upon him. Do they have political correctness in Israel? We have it in America, and I can tell you that what Warraq says is sadly all too true in the American context. I don't know if you have this problem here, but there's a style of academic thought, let's call it, in teaching that really depends on spraying charges of racism and imperialism and sexism and homophobia and everything else to demonize those that you would like to demonize. Sometimes the insults are couched in academic-sounding language, as with the founding father of post-colonial studies, Edward Said, whose mendacious spirit hovers over BDS. And sometimes they're even less subtle. For example, the liberal political theorist Alan Johnson, in his chapter of the Case Against Academic Boycotts of Israel, reports having one of his own lectures interrupted by refrains of the clever taunt, "Fuck off our fucking campus, you fucking Zionist." The point is that both, and you can find that in the book if you want to examine this interesting argument in more detail. The point is that BDS professors and student activists are not just rude. The point is that they're comfortable rejecting norms of civility, not only in practice, as it were by accident now and then when they get carried away, but in principle and in theory, while defending this unethical practice with radical philosophies that denigrate quotidian politeness, ordinary decency, and standards of scholarship. All of this is considered by them in their theoretical writings to be just mere bourgeois prejudice when it comes to dealing with Zionists. Now, at last, a brief concluding word about what I call the Israel fetish. In the atmosphere on campus of selective inclusiveness and intolerant tolerance, as enforced by the codes of political correctness, Israel is in danger of becoming the key symbol or master signifier of un-PC insensitivity to not just some, but, believe it or not, all of the world's pitiable victims. I started by talking about this, and I'm going to conclude with this now. Once again, Stephen Salaita put it well, this time on social media, when he tweeted the following: "Hate is such a strong word. That's why it's my preferred verb when discussing racism, colonization, neoliberalism, sexism, and Israel." Well, one of these things is not like the other. Note that alongside the boycott movement's favorite word, hate, only one of these terms is in fact a proper noun or name referring to a particular concrete, geographic, and political entity, or anything particular at all. The rest are all labels for either patterns of behavior stigmatized as immoral, or states of mind understood to be beyond the pale. That's what I mean by calling Israel the fetishized sign of insensitivity, or master signifier of malevolence, capable of representing all sorts of wrongdoing in the eyes of her detractors, condensing it, embodying it, giving it a location, giving it an address. Israel thus serves a useful psychological function. Hating Israel, it turns out, is a lot like what fearing witches or other dark supernatural beings always was, a welcome relief from having to face the fact that in life there exists a certain amount of suffering which we don't immediately know what to do about. As another prominent BDS professor put it in a blog post defending Salaita's infamous tweets, which I've quoted to you, he writes, Israel has come to be associated in the eyes of many with colonization, racism, occupation, and ethnic cleansing. Indeed, the blogger, a prominent American professor of political science and my brother-in-law, should know, I won't name him, my sister forbids me from referring to him in print. This isn't being recorded, is it? I have to, oh well. We'll see how Pesach goes next time. Well, anyway, indeed, he should know about these associations because BDS thinkers like him labor so tirelessly to produce and promote precisely these kinds of slanderous associations. And it's more than just the blogs and tweets of some extremists, even in the case of the notorious Professor Salaita. In his book on Temple University Press, which I cited earlier, and not just in his tweets, he writes, I conceptualize Zionism as deeply inhumane ethically and as destructive politically for Jews and Arabs alike, and for humanity in general. Moreover, this supercharged scapegoating mentality in which one small country bears the weight for all of humanity's suffering in general on its shoulders circulates between faculty and students. It's not all just highfalutin theory. As the San Francisco Bay Area activist Laura Kiswani put it recently at a public rally, bringing down Israel will really benefit everyone in the world. I guess that includes us here tonight. We just don't know it. We're brainwashed. And everyone in society. Not only everyone in the world. And particularly workers. Well, you can see how it would benefit workers and everyone in society and everyone in the world, since Israel is responsible for racism, sexism, colonialism, and neoliberalism. In short, and to conclude, Israel, it seems, is magic indeed. The very epicenter of all injustice. Many other examples of this kind of fetishism. I know Israel can't really be a unique source of harm to the whole planet, but nevertheless, I feel that it is, and I will say so at the top of my lungs, could be cited from other texts by authors tied to BDS if there were time. I do that and other things in my forthcoming book, Israel and the Theory of the Jewish State and the Cultural Left, and in an essay that I plan to have out soon called The Israel Fetish. Thanks for your